Well, good evening, First Baptist Church of Jasper. It's Wednesday night, and it's time for Bible study. And we're going through the healings, a series of healings of Jesus. And this week is the healing of the leper. You might have already begun to wrestle with these different texts of Jesus interacting with this man. But we find this passage, this evening in Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, and in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. And basically these different writers give this story about an equal number of verses. There's really not one that's more overwhelming than the other. And this is where a man who is someone that is considered by his community an outcast. And Jesus interacting with this man who's on the fringes of the community. Interacting with someone that other people don't want to interact with. And the leper is one who stays out of town. He's not welcomed, and he or she is not welcomed in the town. So basically, I guess you could say maybe we've used this terminology over the last few months of being quarantined, and what that must have been like for this man who was quarantined from town, telling you can't come here. Now, leprosy is what we've come to understand from look back in Leviticus chapter 13 and begin to get a better understanding of what leprosy is. There's really nothing that, from what Scripture says, causes it, but it's something where it deals with skin rash, swelling, or boils. But when one had that, one was considered unclean and was removed from the community. And it was seen as contagious. You were not to touch that person who had it. So let's begin by looking at Matthew. So if you got your Bibles in front of you and you want to go ahead and find it, Matthew, I said, verse 8, 1 through 4. So here we go. Starting out with verse 1, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And there was a leper who came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. So there was this idea of Jesus moving from the mountain. Usually when he went to the mountain, it was oftentimes for solitude, for prayer, for refreshing his spirit. And of course, usually in those stories, Jesus is often surrounded by a crowd. So in this moment, this leper takes a risk. This leper takes a risk to move toward Jesus, move toward the crowd. So I imagine there was probably some looks from the crowd thinking, what are you doing interacting with, this group is clean, you're unclean, you need to stay over there. But he takes a risk, and he approaches him. He kind of breaks Jewish law. And so in chapter 3, in verse 3, can't talk tonight. He stretched out his hand and he touched him, saying, I do choose, be made clean. So Jesus touched the man. This was something that, this was unheard of within the culture, to do that for a clean person to touch someone who was unclean, but Jesus touched them. And imagine the reaction of the crowd. Wow, to think that's something that people just didn't do. And immediately the leprosy was cleansed. So in this moment it was gone. So Jesus breaks the Jewish law to heal the man. And then Jesus said to him, in verse 4, said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So Jesus makes this puzzling statement. Don't go and don't say anything about this. Just be quiet, but go and present yourself to the priest and give a gift. So in a way, some moments Jesus is pushing back on Jewish tradition, Jewish law, and in some moments Jesus is affirming, saying, go to the priest, go offer a gift. So now that we've gone through that, and Jesus says, don't tell anyone about this. It's puzzling. I wonder why Jesus said that. So let's go over to Mark and see the differences, the similarities that Mark has to offer in his account. Verse 40 in chapter 1. So since there's no birth narrative, in Matthew and Luke, there is the mention of the birth of Jesus and stories on that. But because there is, in Mark does not feel it's important to write about the birth of Jesus and that part of the story, that he can go ahead at the beginning in the chapter 1 and begin to talk about his public ministry of Jesus. Verse 40. A leper came to him begging him. Kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." So in Matthew, he goes ahead and says, he makes a request, but in Mark, the leper approaches Jesus and gives an open and said, "I'd love for you to help me, but that's totally up to you." And the interesting thing about here is in Matthew, Jesus comes down the mountain. He begins to talk about the crowd, but in this situation, there's not a mountain. He's not coming down from the mountain. There's not a crowd. So moving on to 41. Moved by pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Did the same thing in Matthew. Touched him. Had this close interaction. He said, "I do choose. Be made clean." And in 42 it says, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. So in this passage it talks about the idea of clean. After sternly warning him, this was Jesus talking, warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer yourself cleansing that Moses commanded as a testimony." So Jesus kind of makes this puzzling statement and says, okay, and he's firm about it. He says, don't say anything. But in verse 45, the man that was healed, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer stay into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. So then, there was no mention of this in Matthew. Matthew didn't feel like it was that important, but the man couldn't help it. He was so, moved by Jesus' interaction with him. We don't know how long the man had struggled with leprosy and how people had interacted with him. And he was so moved by Jesus just reaching out and interacting with him, touching him, and not just that, but and then again helping him and taking that leprosy away. That even though Jesus said that to him, it didn't. He couldn't hold it in. He had to say something, but it affected Jesus' foot traffic, where he could go, where he couldn't go. So it just makes you wonder, why did Jesus say this? That he had to move from the town to the country. But yet people still came out to interact with him. So now let's move to Luke. So it gives and even in Mark it kind of gives a reference that he was in the city, or he was in town. So Mark chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. Here we go. Once, when he was in the city, there was a man covered with leprosy. So, the leper came into town, and so the leper was breaking the law. And it's just kind of like in Mark, but no mention of coming down from the mountain, no mention of a crowd, like in Matthew. But in this moment, see, it says, there was a man covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he bowed his face. A different approach. He bowed his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean." So, here's a unique description of how the man approaches Jesus, where in the past he's yelled out or he's just run up to Jesus and said, "Help me." This man shows a little bit more reverence in his approach. And then Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Again, this idea of this personal contact is it goes through Matthew, Mark, and Luke. How powerful that is, and how I guess the writers, all three, saw the importance of explaining to their audience the idea of Jesus interacting with someone who most people didn't want to interact with. He said, "Stretch out his hand." He touched him and he said, "I do choose. Be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he ordered him to tell no one. "Go," he said, "and show yourself to the priest. And as Moses commanded, make an offering for your cleansing for a testimony." But now, more than ever, the word about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds would gather around him to be cured of diseases. But he would withdraw to deserted places and pray. So again, Jesus makes this puzzling request. Hey, don't tell anybody that I did this. This is between us and the fence post. But go do your Jewish traditions of going to the temple, making your offering. But the word spread. It doesn't say that the leper told folks. It could have been that there was a crowd there that Luke just doesn't talk about, but the word spread because that they talked about it when he went, and he might have been quiet. And other people, now this was unique to Luke, other people came to Jesus looking for help from what they were struggling with, and that's just unique to Luke. But in Luke, it talks about Jesus doesn't just go from Mark, it talks about Jesus going to the country to get away to the countryside. But in Luke, it says he withdraws to deserted places to pray. So just some interesting perspectives of the I guess to say the things that all three of these writers have in common, and then just the minute details of the differences, and just putting the pieces together and begin to see a much bigger and better picture of what happened in this powerful moment. So just a few thoughts about this passage. Jesus, in a way, I guess to say, talks out of both ends of his mouth. In some ways, he pushes back on Jewish culture of clean and unclean interacting with one another. He pushes back on that. He embraces someone that's considered unclean. But yet, at the end of the interaction, he says, "Now go and present yourself to the priest and make an offering." So Jesus is not throwing, I guess you would say, the baby out with the bathwater. He's just saying, with Jewish culture, Jewish law, he's just saying, he's pushing back on certain elements, but saying, go and make an offering for this. Why did Jesus touch the leper in this moment? Jesus could have said the words possibly and it was gone. But I wonder if he touched the leper, not just for the man to realize that he was worth that human touch, but maybe it was for the surrounding people in the crowd to help them realize this man who y'all quarantined, who y'all told to go off, that he's worth interacting with. This clean and unclean thing is maybe not so healthy. And then Jesus gives this puzzling statement to not tell anyone. So, maybe Jesus was wishing to avoid, certain popularity. Maybe Jesus was worried about getting pushback from the community, being able to interact with people, that people might, it might put a target on his back. It might have to do with, let's not bring up any messianic expectations that people might have if a lot of people see me do this interaction with you could really begin to spread the narrative too quickly, too fast, in a way that Jesus wasn't ready for. I don't know. But the man's talking affects Jesus' foot pattern. And he has to change that. He has to go from town out to either deserted places or out to the countryside to avoid because either the man opened up his mouth or the people in the crowd said they wanted to talk about it. They were moved. And one last thought is this labeling folks as unclean. The Jews, I feel like unfairly labeled this man, and so because of that, the man had to change his foot pattern. They were threatened. They were uncomfortable by what the man struggled with, and so they saw him as someone who could affect them. And so Jesus in that moment kind of took that stereotype, that label, and just kind of blew it out of the water and said a person who's clean and unclean can interact with one another. And we all do this. Unfortunately, every culture often does this. That we label people that we're uncomfortable with. We label people that maybe look different. We label people that present themselves different than us, and we quarantine ourselves from them, or we quarantine them from us. We push them away, and we hold sometimes unhealthy opinions, because then if we have that moment to get a close enough interaction with someone that we've unfairly labeled, and sometimes we realize, hey, we were wrong. We had some misconceptions about this person. And then it also, that close interaction that Jesus had with the man that was the leper, that in those close interactions, sometimes we begin to make connections. We begin to see, even though we might be different, we have some similarities. We have connections. We have more in common than we think we do. And so it's something that we struggle with, I think, as all of us as humanity, that we label people, unfortunately, that we don't know, or that we're not sure about, or that are different than us. And so this is just one of those passages that can often help us push back in our mind on the things that we unfairly do to other people. And the last thing is that Jesus always was about bringing folks into community. this man was quarantined and seen as an outcast until his leprosy passed, and how Jesus was all about bringing folks on the outside to the inside. And so we have that call, that purpose to bring the folks who are the outcasts, bring the folks who are in the fringes, bring them back into community so they can find healing, they can find comfort, they can find strength from being around humans. Because one thing that's been the hardest for us over the past several months is that lack of connection that we've had to one another, that distance that we've had to keep, opposed to when we wanted to be together, we wanted to hug or shake hands or be able to sit beside someone that we can't be able to do. So that wraps up the healing of the leper. Next week, if you want to go ahead and do a little bit more reading just to prep, we're going to go. Now, the last few weeks, we've just been looking at parables in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, ones that were consistent all the way, or ones that found themselves in the different books. One of the Gospels we haven't looked at is John. So next week, we are going to look at John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. This was Jesus. I can't talk tonight. This was Jesus and the healing of the man who was born blind. So thanks for joining me. Hope you have a good evening, and look forward to seeing you next week we have one more week with the healings of Jesus, and then we'll move on to a new study. So have a good night.